to offer the perspective of a painter who's contributed to this church. And I'm put in mind in this context, there's a attractive saying that some early modern writer put in the mouth of St. Benedict, laborare est orare, to work is to pray. And artists tend to like this saying because they can get away with it. It makes them feel that whenever they work with the stuff of the world and effect transformations on it, there's a possibility at least that they might be some kind of voice and vehicle for God and God's grace. It's a nice thought. It's a nice half thought, because if to work was to pray, human affairs would be a damn sight simpler. But anyway, I think that's the thought that Matisse probably had in mind to reach for the high point of 20th century religious art, if you like, or one of them, about the time he was making the Vence Chapel in late part of his career in the 1940s. And he writes, "Do I believe in God? Yes, when I'm working. Quand je suis soumis et modeste, when I'm submitted and modest, I feel myself greatly aided by someone who makes me feel things that are beyond my own powers. Yet I have no sense of recognizing him. Je ne me sens envers lui aucune reconnaissance, because it's as if I'm before a conjurer whose tricks I cannot fathom." Now, I think what Matisse is negotiating in that statement, as well as his awareness of God, is the fact that his own cultural formation, the people he comes from, the art set, is a pretty anti-clerical faction of society, and that statements of creedal orthodoxy, etc., are liable to wrong-foot you with most of your traditional friends if you come from the Parisian avant-garde. And so he wants to keep a fair distance and does so rather elegantly. And I think, that's Matisse making this amazing chapel in southern France in the late 40s, slightly after the work in this church. But I think there's a comparable spirit to the work of these painters who indeed knew Matisse and kind of operated in some of the same Parisian circles, because once the Bloomsbury artists were children and grandchildren of a section of the Victorian intelligentsia who'd made a break with God and with the church and declared for agnosticism. And equally, they were part of a skeptical, non-creedal art world. And at the same time, when Bishop Bell made his noble proposition that this church be decorated and lead a revival of Christian involvement in the arts in the early 40s, he gave them an opportunity to work with the kind of context they had most faith in of all, because an English artist's education was premised on Italy, on Tuscany, and it was premised on Giotto, Fra Angelico, Piero della Francesca, Botticelli, all these influences that you can see, sense in this space. And it meant that they at last would have a chance to put themselves into the shoes of those great predecessors who, they'd known from their youth. And in a great context. And so, at once, they could kind of suspend whatever their intellectual position was about Christianity and produce a art that was in good faith because it was talking to their what they truly and affirmatively believed in, which was, if you like, Giotto and Piero. And to communicate it in this popular context, you have to talk to a large, broad congregation, and you have to, at the same time, take the orthodox symbolism and, if you're Duncan or Vanessa, turn it into a more sensuous, a more this-worldly idiom for it to make sense to yourself. So, it's very much an affirmation of these surfaces, these volumes, these colours, all the glory of this world. And so, to work is to pray, in a certain sense for them. But perhaps not in a very, not for a completely transcendent sense. It's a this world, it's an immanent idea of the divine. And it's limited at the points, perhaps particularly this altarpiece, the altar, which is naturally the direction in which the worshipper thinks about what is beyond the visible and the palpable and what is transcendent. And in a sequence of events which was before Peter Blee's time, which I don't fully know the details of, there was this question about what happened to my father's own work at the altar, which originally stood behind the altar and now stands in the north aisle there. And I put to you the most wonderful work by my father. It's actually behind this screen. You need to come behind it. It's an extraordinary piece of ingenious painting behind the chancel arch. But this also is a work of great seriousness. But it does come to a very strange place, I think, as a painting. And the strange place it comes to is, ostensibly, it's a supper at Emmaus, a recognition of Christ at the dinner table, traditional scene. But the net effect of the painting is that the chalice becomes a chalk pit in the downs. The whole painting converges on this hollow in foot of Mount Caban, as it might be, across the landscape. And so it was felt, obviously, and I can remember seeing this and thinking, it doesn't quite reach all the parts that you want an altarpiece to reach. And in 2002, it was removed and taken over to the North Aisle, which left in its place the foregoing Victorian architectural structure, which you can see. The only photo I've got of it is this photo at a harvest festival or a flower festival, and you can see these bare arches, 5 trefoil arches in a Victorian Gothic styling with bare concrete render behind them, and a kind of shop crucifix put in the middle, and lots of lovely flowers, beautiful in this photo, but possibly a bit of a letdown for the whole space. And this, I have to interpolate for Peter because he ain't here, and I wish he were, but he is thinking this needs something more charged, stronger to affirm worship. And that's where he invites David Hensel to bring in his sculpture, or to produce a sculpture, which is a powerful visionary piece. There it is in the centre. Here we can look at it in isolation. A kind of fusion of the human, the all-important human and the all-important organic in this extraordinary original design. And it comes from a very different kind of artistic tradition, very different to the work around it. It is not this worldly in the way that the work of Vanessa or Duncan is. And there it is, occupying a bare space for a decade or so, I think, isn't it? And it must be about 10 years that it must have been. 6 years, I beg your pardon. But, considerable time, and a feeling that maybe this wasn't the end of the story on Peter's part. And this is where Peter Blee turns to me. Now, I have got a small and ridiculous foothold in this church foregoing, because, again, if you step into the chancellors, you must, you will see me on the side of the vestry door. There I am. Later in the 1970s, and there are many modifications in this church, my dad was asked to have a go at an extra decoration, and so he did this grisaille fresco. He did some flowers over there, and there were 2 angel supporters of a shield, and there I was, vaguely kneeling, covered in blankets, on the corner of a bed in our house, posing and then being mirrored in reverse. So that's me, folks. But apart from introducing myself as a painted person, as a painter, Peter will have turned to me. Sorry? Are you all right? Oh. I turned off something. Steve did, that's all right. Okay. As a painter, I am of a rather different temperament, I suppose, to the preceding generations of the family. And whereas, my Victorian forebears were seceded from the Church of England, I seceded somewhere down the line from agnosticism and atheism and all that. And though I'm not a member of a Christian church, I've always been very serious in or tried to be very serious in my approach to matters of religion. And so Peter, in 2015, saw an exhibition of mine in which I was doing a sequence of works based on the book of Genesis, and this is the primal verses, "Let there be light," coming out of darkness, and the sequence carried on through the book of Genesis until it reached that infinitely puzzling and dark image of the difficulty of God, which is the Jacob's fight at night with the other on the banks of the river Jabbok. And so I'm interested in using a lot of different techniques, as even those 2 images show. And at the same time, I'm very interested in working with not just stories, but the given of the landscape. And for instance, this is a painting that's about to be shown. I have an exhibition opening in Lewes at the beginning of October in the Star Gallery, and it will feature paintings like this, which, as you can see, are descriptive. And I'm standing out there in the fields painting the downs. And so I had this kind of, that was the kind of range I had as an artist, and Peter suggested that I might want to come up with something to address that difficult space behind the altar, that difficult but important space in this church. And thereby, well, this is kind of embarrassing, the following bit, because I have to talk about my mistakes and my stupidities. But anyway, confession time. It's we're a learning process, let's call it that. So I look at this, firstly, as obviously a wonderful opportunity to work in a public and serious and godly space, and a great honour to take it on. And at the same time, you are working with the Givens, you're working with David's noble sculpture, you're working with the altar, you're working with the apse light. You are kind of squeezed between the white of the top of the altar cloth and that apse light. And how are you going to work with it? So at first, because we'd been talked about that first image of mine, this one, which is a very abstracted image, I was thinking, we'll have some kind of. These were vague sketches which I submitted to Peter, and I said we'll have some kind of galaxy of light surrounding, the love which moves the stars and other planets, and surrounding the central crucifix. And then, contrastingly, my confused mind thought, no. Christ wants to be in here's this organic form which David has created, and it's invested in the forces of growth and vegetal expression and so on, and perhaps it all wants to be in the middle of a dark forest. So anyway, these humble sketches were submitted to the parish committee, who kind of went, And parish committees and diocesan committees and historic buildings committees and the tale could be very elaborate and tedious if I were to go through it at full length. But they deliberated, or whatever people do. I don't know, how do you deliberate? And they said, not quite. And then another meeting came up, and I thought, let's cheer them up. Instead of these silly ideas, let's get... we'll try and talk like Vanessa and Duncan and Angelica, who painted the altar, my aunt, and so on. We'll talk affirmatively about the landscape around us, and we'll have a flower, and perhaps a down somewhere distantly. We'll have a flower meadow, and downs distantly behind it. And with that design, provisionally, I got away. I got a foothold, at least, in their space, and a bit of. Peter was very, very patient and generous throughout. Sort of supported my cause through all these fumbles. And then I looked at it hard and I thought, no, this is the kind of painting that bores me. Because I'm not quite so much of a this worldly painter as these guys. I love distance in paintings. Good modernists, they like flat paintings, they like it full on and so on. It's all there in front of you, the colour, the shape, the mass. I like looking at a Claude Lorraine and going, off into the distance. So I, at the last minute, I thought, no, I'll take a mower through that meadow. And much better idea. We'll make a little path that's going through it. That feels nicer. That in that form, for some reason, I got away with it, and the whole thing eventually. This must have taken about 4 years, 3 years. I think the process started in 2017. The process got going, but it rumbled on through the worthy mechanisms of the C of E and other important bodies until this was approved. And at that point, I got into cahoots with my friend. My friend is Simon Goodman, and he's a carpenter, and he's a very good carpenter, and He's a very serious Catholic as well. And he said, right, if you're going we need to make the panels to fit these alcoves. And he made these beautiful oak panels. They were about an inch thick with thick battens behind. And they were just scarily beautiful. These things turned up at my studio, these heavy oak panels of seasoned wood. And I thought they're much too good to paint. And they're certainly much too good to paint with anything like this. And so I had to up my game. And the whole design had to change and had to depart from what had been approved by innumerable committees. And I realized that, in fact, we needed to open out the landscape, and we needed to take the Cuckmere Trail, despite what Nick said, we could lead it down to Cuckmere Haven and the sea. And even though no actual access of visibility exists like that, let's have a road opening out, because everyone knows the sea is behind them hills. And then let's affirm the Sussexiness of it all. I mean, this is sheep country. Let's have a shepherd's hut somewhere behind the cornfields and the poppies. And let's have old Sussex walls. And all these contributory factors came into the composition at this last stage, given the impetus of these rather dauntingly beautiful pieces of oak that I'd got to deface. And then, finally, the thought came, yes, but the whole composition spread out as it is over 5 panels somehow needs to converge, have some hieratic sense. An altarpiece is necessarily a hieratic piece of work. It centers the attention, it stills the attention. It's got to be symmetrical in some sense. And purely for that reason, I thought, oh yeah, we could have a transition, we could have a rainbow. Do. This thought, we could have, from clouds to light. Oh, yeah. So that's a thought that came to me January last year, January 2020. So the whole thing got painted January, February 2020. And this is the peculiar twist to the tale, that there I was painting this thing, these hefty oak panels in my studio through February of last year. And meanwhile, this thing was creeping up on us. And so, yes, here it is with the rainbow centered round. And I think, in a quite satisfactory theological symbolism, if you like, affirming that Jesus is the God of the crucifix, but he's also the God of I do set my bow, the God who makes his covenant with the earth. Making this kind of affirmative and consoling symbol. And all unawares, I find at the time we've got something ready to install, suddenly that symbol has stolen up on us. And it has become this universal symbol in the country. This beautiful symbol, which I believe originated in an NHS program that was trying to make sort of declare its inclusiveness to LGBTQ people. It's quite interesting that it kind of stole up from sideways on the nation generally, and became a universal redemptive symbol. And so what I'm describing is basically a process of walking backwards into understanding something. You see, all my decisions along that route were decisions taken in good faith, but expediently. That won't do. we need to correct that. That's hopeless. We need to satisfy the requirements. And in that sense, we eventually arrive at something which I think, at any rate for the present, until the next generation of reredos in 10 years' time or something, seems to make people happy, which I'm very thrilled by. But it's not cleverness on my part. It's just kind of working desperation, but perhaps your working desperation does make you some kind of vehicle or conduit for the purposes of grace. That I'm going to have to leave that floating because I don't know how very well to express it in conversation. But I found that the whole thing ended in the right place, and I can take questions along with Nick, whose talk I thought was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
Are we competing with lunch?
Yeah, we're holding people from their lunch. It's good for them.
If I may, I'd like to ask a question to Nick. Very interesting talk around these nature rituals that you describe as being part of the original concept of pilgrimage. What in your mind, if anything, separates that interaction with nature and the people doing those actions from what was happening pre-Christian? In other words, is there a specifically Christian difference to the interaction compared to, obviously, a lot of the things that went on prior to being Christianity?
I could spend 3 years going through what I did in my studies. You've exactly hit the nail on the head. Talking to people about Christianity in continental Europe, people were schooled in Greco-Roman thoughts and morality. They had an emperor. They had ideas of a universal rule of law, so on. Try that in tribal Britain and Ireland. It's like, thanks, you can go over there now, please. Didn't work. They time and again they tried to preach morality to tribal Britain. Love your enemies. They were heavily armed next door tribe who would not be returning the love, so on. It doesn't work. A lot of the conventional ways of converting people simply didn't work in a tribal society. So they had to demonstrate the truth of their religion, and the religions in Britain were very much kind of constellated around places in the landscape, very much in the kind of places of spiritual power, holy wells, mountains, so on. Very few reference we have to them talk about places being deadly. Tops of hills were seen as deadly. We don't really know what that means, but they were seen as spiritually perilous. So the saints would then go and spend the night on top of those hills, or an island, which is like a hill in the sea, and they would convert it to demonstrate. And I thought actually this thing about the chalice being in the landscape and the chalk pit, it suddenly occurred to me there as well, that again is that bleeding out.
Yes, of course, it's an industrially produced chalice.
Aren't they all though?
But
they're
yes.
all work of human hands.
Yes, yes.
And there's this chalice in the landscape, which I think embellishes it too. It's a very good way to connect to where people were concerned about. They're worried about the weather. They weren't worried about whether they should marry their brother's wife or whatever, the stuff like that. The morality didn't kick in, but the landscape spirituality did have an effect.
But are you saying that there was an element of pagan customs that began with it all?
Well, it made sense to pagans, yeah. So I guess if you go into a cave that was haunted, I mean, the sacred trees, for example, in Europe, they cut them down because they had the backing of a powerful army, and that was how the model was. And so they would cut down Thor's oak, for example. They'd go and they'd chop them down. There's no stories about sacred trees being cut down in Britain or Ireland during the conversion period. So they would go and decimate the flora and fauna in continental Europe, which you can do if you have a rule of law behind you and an army and authority. But you go into tribal Britain, so we're just going to chop down your sacred tree. People go, well, actually, no, no. Yes, the doors. We'll call you. Thanks for coming by, and less of the myrrh next time. So you had to work with people's.
Several of the previous versions of your screen had the actual reredos itself decorated.
Yeah.
Was that considered? And
I decided that it was better not to. I just thought it wasn't my business. I thought if it was necessary, if it was organic, to me, I'd have done it. I thought it looked better without. And if you don't need to do something, eschew it. But you know, it may be that someone will come along. Churches change, and they may wish to come and decorate it around it. I don't know. That's how I feel.
We are running a little overdue, but if there is another question, I think we can. Thank you.
Yes, it's a question really for both of you, I think, in a sense, in that when I look at the altarpiece, and particularly in the light of the previous talk, it speaks to me of pilgrimage. It speaks to me of sort of stepping outside of the church and going somewhere else, and it turns the church, or particularly that wall of the church, into a very liminal sort of space. And I wondered if that spoke to either of you in that way.
Yeah, beyond. It would be kind of the word I'd use. You know, it takes you beyond and out into the larger thing. That's because one doesn't want to translate everything in the painting into words anyway. But that's the kind of intention to me, and I hope it can, you know, kind of converges with the thoughts that Nick has been raising.
It's like a window. I mean, an icon is a window as well to a redeemed world, and it's just to show that as the local landscape and so on. Steve, when he was pointing it out to me, and we were talking about it when I came in, said it's like it's glass, and you're looking through. It's got that real bright vibrancy of colour, and
maybe that's why the surrounding decoration would have been superfluous.
Yeah,
yes,
maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, it wouldn't.
Yeah.
I love it. I'm going to take a picture of my wife and venerate it on a daily basis. It's everything for me. That kind of connection to place, and the idea of pilgrimage as well. I love that it is, and it's a pilgrimage on the doorstep, and it's kind of obviously facing east as well. And you've got the sun represented. I can't.
Facing east. Yeah.
Yeah.
On that note, as I don't see any other hands really, I think we might make our own pilgrimage rather to the lunch tent. But thank you both